Okay. Yeah. All right. So I'm going to be stuck over here because I'm recording this. So I'm usually not this robotic. Uh, so I just want to warn you in advance. I'm also going to read from the slides word for word because I know how enjoyable that is for people. No, in all honesty, what we have 5 goals for our time together today. The first one is we're going to discuss prevalence. The second thing is we're going to discuss the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria. We're going to look at a tool called the Craft. How many of you have used the Craft before? All right, good. So those of you who've used it before, help others. It'll be fun. We're going to practice a little bit, and we're going to talk a little bit about addiction stigma. My goal here primarily is for you all to understand what substance misuse diagnosis looks like and to start to practice actually using it. But I want to start off by putting it in context. So how many of you have heard of Virginia Mayer? All right, so anyway, for those of you who are interested in the universe beyond what's happening in the social work class, this is a woman who was a prolific photographer and died in absolute obscurity, and this guy was bidding on what's in people's storage units, and he found thousands and thousands of her photos. And she's this incredible photographer. And when they were discussing this photograph in the documentary of her life, which is very interesting, they described this person as a typical alcoholic. And I guess I just wanted to say that one of the things that's incredibly important about this topic is that somebody told me a long time ago, when you're working with somebody, try to kind of imagine not so much where they are, but where they came from. And we all have different ideas about the universe and the way the universe works, but I kind of believe almost everybody came fresh and pure. A close friend of mine had a postcard she kept in her wallet for a long period of time, and it said, you know, it is not a slight thing when those so fresh from God love us. And I just try to think about how do I look at you as you are in front of me right now, and how did you get from being brand new and fresh to where you are today? What's that journey like? So the second thing I wanted to share with you was an interesting thought that came up today, and Lauren Powers wrote that we must look outside of individual choice into environmental factors to truly understand an individual's choice to start to use an illicit drug. Why did they choose to use the drug in the first place? And I just think that that is one of the most salient and important thoughts that you can have when you're diagnosing anything, but particularly when it comes to substance use disorders. So I just want to say thank you to Lauren for sharing that thought with us. And then I have an agenda, but it's your class. So I just wanted, before we move on, to ask you if you had anything that you wanted to share or anything that you wanted to see covered. I know that you had experiences of going to the 12-step meetings. Some of you, not all of you, did that. Or anything from the readings, or any questions from practicum or work experience or anything else. If you have anything that you want to have covered, please let me know, either now or as we're going through this. Stop me at any particular point. So anything specific that anybody wants to talk about before I get going? Going once? Going twice? Okay. So what I'd like you to do right now is a very sophisticated task. I'd like you to draw a circle. And please don't color it in. I tried to find an empty circle. Not very hard. So I ended up using this one. So probably the most important thing that you need to know about substance use disorders, if you are never going to think about it again in your life as a professional social worker, a path I strongly do not recommend, but if that's the path you choose, the one data point that you should have in your mind is that approximately 24 million Americans above the age of 18 present with an active substance use disorder. And what that means is that 1 in 10 adults present with a substance use disorder that is relevant or that would be appropriate to be treated by an addiction or mental health professional. So whatever you're interested in, if you're not interested in substance use disorders, and I mean whatever you're interested in, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, bipolar disorder, whatever, dementia, go look at the prevalence data on that. The prevalence of substance use disorders dwarfs the prevalence of most other mental or diagnostic criteria that we measure in the DSM, in some cases dramatically. So this is extremely prevalent. So now that you've drawn the circle, what I'd like you to do is there are 5 primary substances that I would like you to think about. And you might want to just take a little note on these. Alcohol, marijuana, prescription pills, cocaine, and heroin. And what I'd like you to do is take approximately a minute and turn your circle into a pie chart. There are 24 million Americans that are impacted by these. How do you think that divides up? What percentage have alcohol problems? What percentage have marijuana problems? What percentage have cocaine problems, prescription pill problems, and heroin problems? It's okay. We're not going to collect these. It's not on your licensure exam. Just take a guess. It should be on your licensure exam. No, for right now, good point, good question. The question is, are there people that are addicted? Is there such a thing as polysubstance abuse? There is. But right now, I'm just asking for your idea about the data as it relates to those 5 areas. Yeah. And then could you hand out the first handout, please? How cool of you. Thank you. That's really nice. So there are 2 pieces that I want you to see from this. Well, actually, look at what you wrote and look at the data for the top circle and tell me what you think about the top circle versus what you wrote. Are there any observations or thoughts about that at all? Were you close? Okay. How were you not close? So I did this exercise with you for 2 reasons. One is that most people, including people who work in this field, get it wrong. So if you did, by the way, did anybody get it right? Yes. Wow. Okay. Come teach me. All right, you guys come up here, right? All right. No, a lot of people get this wrong. And the reason a lot of people get this wrong is that ideas about substance misuse in this country are not driven by science. They are driven by media. And the most prevalent conversation that we have in our country today about substance misuse revolves around what substance? Heroin, in particular, right? And one of the things that's interesting is that if you look at this data, and if you trust me, and I'm saying 10% of adults have a problem with substance use disorders, then what this data is saying is that about 600,000, or about 5% of all people with substance use disorders have a problem with heroin, which means that about 1 person in 200 in this country 1 person in 2,000 in this country has some kind of problem with heroin. Now I added another circle in there with another drug. And what drug did I add? Now, how many of you, before we started talking today, thought of tobacco as tobacco use as a substance use disorder? Thank you, because it is. And it has all the same kind of psychological markers involved with it that are involved with other kinds of substance use disorders. So it's really important, not when you're thinking about substance use disorders for people, not just to think about what you knew, but think about them in terms of prevalence. And when somebody's sitting in front of you, they have a 10% chance of having a substance use disorder. That means that the substance that they're using may likely be a tobacco product, may likely be an alcohol product. As you move away from marijuana, the prevalence of substance use disorders becomes extremely small. Interestingly enough, our service delivery system is really pointed at a small fraction of people who actually have substance use disorders. And the reason this is relevant to you and the reason this is really important for this topic will be disclosed in just a moment. That's what 24 million looks like. It's a big number. But here's a more important number. Even though there are 24 million people in the country that have substance use disorders, there's only treatment available for 1 out of 10 of them. So if you have a substance use disorder and you want treatment, there are only 2.4 million treatment slots available to Americans annually in the United States, which means that 90% of people who have substance use disorders are not treated. And the vast majority of those people are not incarcerated. That number is about 5.25 million if you include people on probation and parole. About 2.25 million people are actually in jail or prison. Right? They're not living in the streets. They're not homeless. They are police officers. They're ministers. They're doctors. They're social workers, actually at prevalence rates statistically significantly higher than the general population. There are friends. There are neighbors. And so understanding this issue is incredibly important. And one of the biggest reasons it's important, and this is just a small data point for you, just something to consider. I don't have this information from Massachusetts. I have it from New Hampshire. Substance misuse in the state of New Hampshire costs $1.84 billion annually. Predominantly, those costs are wrapped up in 3 areas. Does anybody have any idea what they might be? Say again? Healthcare costs, that's number 1. Bueller? Anyone? No? Okay. Lost productivity from work. And then the last one, criminal justice system costs. Now, the reason I put this number up, in case you didn't know it, the entire operating budget for the state of New Hampshire is about $5.5 billion. So the entire state of New Hampshire runs on $5.5 billion, which is about how much money it costs to run the T in Boston. But anyway, right? The entire state of New Hampshire runs on $5.5 billion. But better than 30% of that cost is impacted by substance misuse in the way that that pulls from refunds, from resources in work productivity, in hospital medical costs, and in criminal justice system costs. So it's not just huge in terms of the number of people it impacts. It's huge in the financial cost. So when people are admitted to hospitals for pulmonary issues or heart-related issues, many, many, many times, those are related directly to substance misuse. And so I just really wanted to drive home that prevalence is a huge issue with this. So thank you for listening to me go on about that. But handout number 2, please. Thank you. So I wanted to talk a little bit about DSM diagnosis. And I just got to see, because Professor Furlong brought this up before class, and I just got to see if I got to feel myself out. How many of you here care about the DSM-4 at all, ever have? Okay, you were right. I thought this is a great handout because what it does is it shows the difference between DSM-4 and DSM-5 diagnosis, which is only relevant if you really cared about DSM-4 before. or if you're a total like addiction treatment nerd like me. So since there aren't a lot of addiction treatment nerds out there, but the thing I do like about this is the blue column really talks about the substance use disorder criteria. And essentially what this does is it breaks down the questions that you really want to wrap your head around as you're assessing substance misuse disorders. So I just want you guys to pause here and just check in with me for a second, because I really want to like drive this point home. When Professor Furlong asked you earlier today about your experiences, and when I asked you about the way that you conceptualize prevalence and gave you some data about costs, hopefully that provided a little bit of a shift for you, some of you, in the way maybe you've conceptualized this before. The most important thing I can tell you about diagnosis is all of those elements, all of those thoughts that you had before Professor Furlong brought up the points and I brought up the points today. Those all influence the way you diagnose people. Your ideas about prevalence, your ideas about what addiction is, who has it, who doesn't, how big a problem it is, how many people it affects. This is really important stuff to know about yourself, no matter where you're working in the field of social work. The way you think about what you're diagnosing not only impacts the way you diagnose people, but obviously it impacts the way you interact with people. And so one of the points I just wanted to put out there is that when you look at these criteria, they're going to ask you questions about what, they're going to ask you questions about how much, they're going to ask you questions about how often. This is the backbone of substance misuse disorder diagnosis. What's the person using? How much are they using? How often? And so when Professor Furlong was talking earlier about, what a standard drink is, it's important to know that if you're going to diagnose alcohol use disorders. Can anybody tell me what a standard joint is? Right? Can anybody tell me what a standard amount of heroin is? Right, so I'm just saying, you can start to see where knowing about this stuff can become extremely idiosyncratic and really important. And the good news is, just when you get to learn like one set of drugs, the culture around drug use changes. So you have new drugs to learn about. Right? This is my second heroin epidemic. The first one happened to me in my neighborhood when soldiers came back from Vietnam when I was a child. Right? Anyway. But there's something more important I want you to consider, and that's this question. Besides what, how much, and how often, what is it you really need when you're conceptualizing a diagnosis around substance misuse disorders? Say it loud. And so for me, at absolutely no additional tuition charge, I'm going to give you a question that you can add into your substance use disorder diagnosis, or at least into the way you conceptualize it, that will help you instantly gain better engagement with people who present with these. And that is, what happens to you when you use alcohol or other drugs? Professor Furlong brought up an excellent point before when she said she had a client who drinks a case of beer. If there are people in this room who drink a case of beer, they're probably not going to acknowledge that in this room, especially if they do it every day. But that question in context for that person, finding out the context that that person didn't think that they had a substance use disorder because their father drank 2 cases of beer, is really relevant. But really, if you start getting into what, how much, and how often, you can really start running circles with people, right? And I don't have time to do it today, but if I told you what the actual safe use guidelines were for alcohol use, like I could watch you all like start to like react to that in this room. They're much less than what you think they are. Right? So when we ask somebody what happens to you when you use alcohol, what happens to you when you use marijuana, what happens to you when you use heroin, we're going to get a much better sense of a way to conceptualize a diagnosis. For me, diagnosis is only valuable really for the patient if it makes sense to them. So if you refer back to the blue column, since the red column is completely and totally irrelevant and will be left out from further handouts, we start off with, have you had times when you ended up drinking more or longer than you intended? Essentially, what this question is asking is, do you think about how much you drink? And then do you drink more than that? In the old school, we would call this attempts to control, right? And when I explain this, let me actually go through a couple here. Have you tried to cut down more than once or twice, but couldn't? And then the last one is spent a lot of time drinking or being sick or getting over the effects of alcohol. So when I'm trying to explain this meaningfully to people around substance use, I use what I call the watermelon example. Would anybody like to volunteer on the watermelon example? It's not going to hurt you. It's not going to embarrass you. It's just a fun thing to do. I need 2 people to do it. Please help me out. Thank you. All right. So, do you like watermelon? No. Okay. So, for the purposes of this lecture, do you like watermelon?
I do.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Do you remember the exact last day you had watermelon?
Yes.
When was that?
Last summer.
No, I mean the exact day, like the day of the... And the day before that? No. And you had watermelon, like you went on a watermelon binge or no? No? Okay. Do you remember the day before that you had watermelon?
No.
Okay. Do you know the exact next day you're going to have watermelon?
No.
Do you have a stash of watermelon in your house? Are you hiding watermelon in your bag? Do you go into the bathroom and use watermelon while the rest of us are, right?
No.
The way you eat watermelon is the way most people drink alcohol. Right? The way most people drink alcohol is they drink it occasionally. They don't remember. By the way, your cohort, this does not exactly apply for. But for most people, the way most people drink alcohol, they don't remember exactly the last time they did it. They're not sure about the next time they're going to do it. It's not something they focus on. They don't shop around it. Right? They're not attempting to control the way they use alcohol. They're not putting a limit on the amount of drinks, when they're going to drink, who they're going to drink with, what they're going to drink. Most people don't drink that way. For most people, the use of alcohol is an occasional experience. Here's an interesting data. Well, let me ask you this. How many people in America, how many adults in America do not drink at all, percentage-wise? What would you think?
What are we talking about?
About 30%. Just don't drink at all.
So that's of adults?
Of adults. People over the age of 18. So when we look at the criteria, what I basically do is the first 3 questions are about: is a person attempting to control their use, failing to control their use, and are they using this and having negative? Are they spending a lot of time using? So one of the things that you can do with time is you can ask somebody to think about how much time do they spend drinking, and if a person says they spend a couple hours a week drinking, that's different if they spend a couple hours a day drinking, or if they're drinking all day long. And one of the nice things about substance use diagnosis is the way to get good at doing it is like any other kind of diagnosis. You do it a lot. It takes about 200 assessments to, I think, on virtually any diagnostic criteria to really start to get a flavor for what it's going to look like. So this is why we have clinical supervision. We have people to talk to about this. But these are just good questions to ask moving into this part. Any questions about what I've said so far? So the next one, criteria 4, is, are you obsessed thinking about the use of alcohol or other drugs? Are you contemplating, sitting through the day wondering when you're going to have your next drink? Are you you may go days in between using, but that that's the next most important thing to you? Have you ever found yourself having physical consequences, social consequences at school from using alcohol? Up into number 6, which is really important. Is your social system coming to you and saying to you, this isn't good? Are your friends, or families, or coworkers, are people saying this to you? One of the reasons this becomes important is the older people get who have substance misuse disorders, the more they build social support spheres around that. So if you have a person whose family has a substance use disorder coming to them saying, maybe you should do something about it, that's something you notice. Have you ever given up or cut back on activities? This is something that really happens a lot for teens. And it happens how many of you work with teens? Right? So like the magical years are 8th grade, if there's a break between 8th grade and high school, and then 10th grade, those are the 2 grades where you'll see people start to give up activities that they had before because they become more socially involved with substance misuse. 8. Gotten into situations while drinking that increased your chances of getting hurt. Drinking and driving. This is the number 1. But there's all kinds of other things that people do that if you know them and you know what their life's about, you can start to see. I live in New Hampshire where a lot of people go mountain climbing drunk. Not a good idea. People get hurt, right? But it happens. Continue to drink even though you weren't getting a good effect from drinking. Now, what you want to notice when you get to 7, 9, 10, and 11 is that you're starting to get into a pretty tricky area around substance use disorder diagnosis, and that's that you're getting to a place where the body is actually starting to become affected. And it's really important to notice that when you get your MSW, you don't get an MD with it. And practicing medicine without a license is against the law in many states. So it's really important that if you're noticing or somebody's talking to you about what appear to be physiological symptoms, that you're talking to or consulting with a physician. Because in some cases, physiological withdrawal from substance use can have significant physical effects, including death. Have you continued to drink even though I think I already said that. Have you drank more than you once did to get the effect? This is called tolerance. And as people use alcohol or other drugs, tolerance increases. And then in the later phases of substance misuse, particularly with alcohol, it can decrease. And then last but not least, those are the questions that are relevant to withdrawal. So those are the diagnostic criteria. Do they make sense? Do you have questions? No? All right. So we're going to, yes? No?
I was just going to ask about having learned about it from the perspective of abuse versus dependence.
Yes.
Is there at all an association between moderate versus severe, that being more mapping onto alcohol dependence in the whole sense of?
So severe would definitely and moderate is really toward abuse, but I think what they wanted to do is they wanted to create more of a continuum out of it. The reason that this is fascinating to you and me and no one else is because I'm a treatment geek, and the diagnosis for substance misuse has changed drastically from the initial DSM to now. And I'm guessing it is going to continue to change drastically because as we grow as a field, we're going to see how much importance the prevalence of it has, and we're going to need to know better how to diagnose it. So, now that you've all been trained in how to do a DSM diagnosis, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to watch this video. And what I'd like you to do is as you're watching this video and you've looked at these, is I'd like you to just practice noting some symptoms that you see in the people that we're watching. And I really hope this is loud enough because I'm not sure how to turn up the volume. Can you turn off the lights back there, please?
I remember it almost as if it was today. A friend of mine who had already been using took me to the roof, and I thought it was so hot. I really wanted. And we went up there, and he had already used heroin. He was using intramuscular.